What's up, everybody? I'm Ernie. I'm back with the Face Off Sports Network, and today we're going to go over a few of our favorite Dynasty wide receiver buys. Let me kick things off with my boy Rashee Rice. So I love Rashee Rice, one of the most undervalued receivers in all of fantasy football right now. Had a monstrous start to last season. And then unfortunately he tore his ACL. I'm sorry, he didn't tear his ACL. He just had a really bad knee injury. And then he missed the rest of the season. So here's why I think Rashee is one of the better dynasty buy lows this year. So he was seventh in fantasy points per route run. He had an 85 plus PFF grade. He actually didn't tear his ACL. It was It was like I don't know what specifically happened, but I think it's good news that he didn't actually tear his ACL. He's already partaking in OTAs. And there's really good intel on him not being suspended this year, so that's also a plus. In the three games that he played last year, the first three games, he averaged 21.6 fantasy points per game. If you flesh that out to over a 17-game season, he was on pace for 368 PPR fantasy points. That would have actually made him the fantasy wide receiver two, just behind Jamar Chase. So Mahomes, this is his true number one. In Rashee, they can line him up everywhere. They can line him all over the field. He thrives from the slot. So, again, I think this is the most undervalued receiver in fantasy football. I think he is a lock. If now that it looks like the injury's behind him and he's not going to get suspended, I think he is a lock to finish top 10 in fantasy points this year for wide receivers. I think he is Mahomes' undisputed number one. I think Xavier Worthy is a nice addition, but I think he's more of a deep threat, that outside guy, kind of, bringing another dynamic to the Chiefs. But I think Rashee is always going to be the guy. He was the guy last year, and I think this year he's going to pick up right where he left off. Second dynasty buy wide receiver we have is Josh Downs. So another one of the more overlooked receivers in fantasy football. This one could be a little bit of a head scratcher for people because you look at the numbers last year, but there's a bigger story than to what the numbers are just presenting to you. So he finished with 72 receptions last year on 102 targets. That was 803 yards and 5 touchdowns. Man numbers, right? But let me get into why I think he's being undervalued. He had an 85 PFF grade. That was 11th amongst all wide receivers. His separation rate was 6th best in the NFL. And these are elite metrics when you take into consideration the quarterback play, right? So, they had a lot of inconsistency there. Anthony Richardson doesn't have the best arm. And the real eye-opener is when he played with Joe Flacco. So there was a 7-game sample in which he played with Joe. Josh Downs' numbers in that 7-game sample was 6.3 receptions, 68.6 yards per game, 10.9 yards per catch, and 3 touchdowns. Now, again, if you flush that out over a 17-game season, he would have finished with 107 receptions, 1,166 receiving yards, and 7 touchdowns. In PPR scoring, that would have translated to 266 fantasy points, right? That would have been wide receiver 8, putting him between Terry McLaurin and CeeDee Lamb. So this is the level of upside I'm talking about here with Josh Downs. And again, a lot of people, and I get it rightfully so, Anthony Richardson and Daniel Jones. I'm going to make a bold take here. I think Daniel Jones wins that job. I think he will be, I don't know if he's, you want to say he's this year's Sam Darnold, but I do think he's going to go to the Colts. I do think he's going to play better. I think they have a very sneaky, good offensive situation. They have a very good offensive line. They have a very good, group of wide receivers, and they have Jonathan Taylor, right? And then to top it all off, you have Shane Steichen, one of the better offensive minds in the NFL. I think there's a reason why, they picked Daniel Jones, and, Adam Schefter had one of the more interesting quotes this offseason, and that was, the consensus has a different opinion than the NFL does on Daniel Jones. And there was actually a bidding war going on for him before he got signed. He went with the Colts because he feels like that's the best place he could start. And I agree with Daniel. Again, it was I'm a New York Giants fan, so I understand. But a lot of times what people aren't taking into consideration is how bad these Jets and Giants teams are. And that's why you get a Sam Darnold. You get a kid that people think is a bust, right? And you put him behind a pretty good offensive line with some good weapons. And, he's throwing for over 4,000 yards and 30 touchdowns. I'm not saying that's what's going to happen with Daniel Jones, but I know Daniel Jones is better than Gardner Minshew and whatever else they had last year. So I'm sorry. Daniel Jones is better than Joe Flacco, who and the other players that they've had in the past. So I think Josh Downs is a smash pick. I think with competent quarterback play, which I think you'll see this year, because it's either going to be Daniel Jones or hopefully Anthony Richardson takes a step. And a lot of people bought into Anthony Richardson last year. I was one of them. So hopefully that this quarterback competition could, unlock that next level of his arm talent, right? Because that's only going to benefit Josh Downs. I think Josh Downs is an easy dynasty buy low. I think his value is only going to skyrocket once he gets competent quarterback play. And my last dynasty wide receiver buy low is Jaylen Waddle, Mr. Waddle. So there's a lot to like about Jaylen Waddle. When you look at his first 3 seasons, he averaged 83 receptions, 1,128 receiving yards, and 15 fantasy points per game. When you look at last year, though, he had a down year, right? And I think that's mainly due to Tua's injury, because when you look at his fantasy points per game with Tua, it was 13 and a half, right? But when you flush that 8-game sample over a 17-game season, it would have given him 230 PPR fantasy points, and that's obviously much better than the 150 that he finished with, right? He has been unbelievable in OTAs. He's still only 26. He's turning 27. And Tyreek is up there in age, and they also might move on from him. There's a lot of like off the field issues, and there's some drama going on with Tyreek Hill. So there is that rumor floating around that Tyreek Hill could, be bounced as early as this year, maybe next year, right? So this could be their wide receiver one as early as this season or next season. So expect a major bounce back season from Jaylen Waddle. I think he's going to get back to, that 230, 250 point fantasy, PPR fantasy points per season range. And yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if he even takes another step, because apparently he looks awesome right now. So that's all I got for you today, guys. Thanks for joining us. Buy low on these wide receivers while everybody, is out on them. They think they stink. A lot of times in fantasy football, you realize that, people see numbers and that's what dictates somebody's value. But things change, situations change, and a lot of times they have, a bad season because of the situation, because their quarterback got hurt. The offensive line isn't good, right? And now you got to look at, well, what's changed? And Jaylen Waddle, man, if he gets a 17-game season with Tua, and imagine if Tyreek Hill got, cut or they traded him or whatever it may be, right? So he would obviously explode onto the fantasy scene. So these are the 3 guys that I would go buy low in your leagues right now. If you have people, put them on the trade block. Definitely, see what they want and see if you could steal these guys. All right, guys, I'll catch you next time.